Good afternoon. I hope everyone can hear me. Can someone just let me know if you can hear me?
We can.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you so much. So again, good afternoon and welcome to the 5th in a seminar series on research ethics offered by the Faculty of Arts of the University of Colombo for postgraduate students. So far in this series, we have covered the application process for ethics approval, digital research and ethical considerations when doing digital research, and ethics in presenting quantitative survey data. All the previous sessions in this series have been recorded and are available on YouTube. You can go to the Faculty of Arts webpage in order to find the link. Now, we will be recording this seminar as well in order for it to be uploaded. So I just want to let all of the participants know that that this seminar will be recorded. Today's topic is ethics in interviewing, a very common method used in research. And we have two resource persons who will be taking you through the seminar today. Let me now introduce both research persons to you. First, we have Asha L. Abeyasekera, who is a lecturer at the Faculty of Graduate Studies of the University of Colombo. Her PhD is from the University of Bath, and she is a program coordinator of the MA in Gender and Women's Studies. She teaches research methodology on 3 MA programs at the Faculty of Graduate Studies of the University of Colombo, as well as at the Postgraduate Institute of English and the Open University of Sri Lanka. Her article, Ethics and the Indigenous Anthropologist, the Use of Friendship in Ethnographic Fieldwork, was included by SAGE Research Methods cases in 2017. Her main research interests are the study of intimate relations and gendered subjectivities in contemporary South Asia. And she is the author of a very recent book titled Making the Right Choice, Narratives of Marriage in Sri Lanka, published by Rutgers University Press in 2021. Our second resource person is Kaushalya Perera, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of English and is at present also the director of postgraduate studies for the Faculty of Arts at the University of Colombo. She has a PhD in applied linguistics from Pennsylvania State University, and her research interests are in language and education policy, Sinhala pragmatics, and children's digital literacy. She has published in the journals Applied Linguistics, Journal of Pragmatics, and Qualitative Research. So over to you. I believe, Asha, you are going to start off the session this afternoon.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Dashi.
You're very welcome. Go right ahead.
Okay. Let me share my screen. So thank you, Dushi, for that introduction, and thank you, Kaushi, for inviting me for this session. Dr. Kaushalya and I have had many discussions over the years about ethics, so this is really nice to be in the same room talking sort of about it again to an audience. So thank you, Kaushi, for inviting me. So I want to start off by just going through the basic principles of research ethics, which many different kinds of associations publish. And this I take from the American Anthropological Association. From 2017, they had revised their guidelines. And one of the key principles, so to the basic overarching principle of research ethics is do no harm, where we as researchers have to ensure that we not only protect the rights of our research participants, but that we take care of their welfare. But of course, we are all, as researchers, because we are in the business of producing knowledge, we are also balancing this by thinking about what kind of benefit our research has to society. And so ethics is also both of these and also a balance between them, protecting our research participants and also thinking about how our research is going to benefit society. So I'm just going to read out the basic principles, which is being open and honest regarding your work. And all of these we will touch on probably today, some more than others. The importance of obtaining informed consent and the necessary permissions, maintaining respectful and ethical professional relationships, protecting and preserving research records, and weighing competing ethical obligations due to collaborators and our affected partners, and making our results or our research writing accessible. So today, my part of the discussion will specifically focus on informed consent and this idea of working with vulnerable populations. There is also, of course, the issue of power and confidentiality, which I think confidentiality Dr. Kaushalya is touching on, but power is something that also requires quite a bit of discussion, but I will focus on these two given the time frame, and maybe we could talk about power in the discussion after our presentations. So when we talk about informed consent and voluntary participation, which is one of the key cornerstones of research ethics, what we mean by that, and this I take a quote from the American Psychological Association, that the participant or the respondent must have all of the information that might reasonably influence their willingness to participate in a form that they can understand and comprehend. Now, this is really important that before we, or when we invite participants to participate in our research, that we are able to give them information about the research that they can understand and comprehend, and that we give as much as information as we can so that they are able to make informed decisions and volunteer to participate. So we are expected to communicate with our respondents the purpose of the research, its expected duration and the procedures, participants' right to decline to participate and to withdraw from the research once it has started without any penalties, reasonably foreseeable factors that may influence their willingness to participate, such as potential risks, discomforts, or adverse effects, any prospective research benefits, and the limits of confidentiality, such as coding, disposal, sharing and archiving, and in instances when confidentiality must be broken, incentives for participation, and who participants can contact with questions. So this is where the information sheet is really important. In this information sheet and the consent form that we produce formally for the ethics review, when we are asking for ethics approval, it's really important that it's not just that piece of paper that we submit to the ERC boards, that it's also important that we really think about how we are going to introduce ourselves when we do get ethical clearance and we go into the field. So you have to have a script about who you are and where are you from and what is your research about. And following up on that is the formal information sheet, which I will share one or two examples from that. And the information sheet is actually really, I want to stress here that it's really important, and I discovered its importance even more in this sort of last 1 year when some of the interviews that I had to do for various research that I was doing had to be done online. And in this case, I discovered, of course, the joy of sharing the information sheet through an email or a WhatsApp photograph, because it made me realize, of course, that where previously I used to go to the field with this information sheet, talk to people, and then give them the information sheet, that the ability to see it before there is full consent given to come or to call and speak to them, that they see what this research is about. They're able to read a piece of paper that sort of gives an overview of what your research is about. So let me just stop sharing and I'll just show you what are some of the basic things that should be included in an information sheet. Okay. So this is a information sheet that Professor Gamila Samrasinghe and I prepared for a research study that we are about to undertake with young people, where we have to first introduce ourselves, to parents, because we are planning to interview young people between the ages of 15 and 18. So here we give information about what the information on the overview and purpose of the research project, where we say very briefly what the research is about, which is about trying to understand how children are socialized in Sri Lanka, and to learn about how norms are inculcated in children and what is considered acceptable behavior. We say who the research collaborators are, that it's the University of Colombo, along with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which is funding the project. There is a section on confidentiality and voluntary participation, which stresses that it's entirely voluntary, that they can say no if they want to, that confidentiality will be maintained, that no information will be shared with any third party. And the fact that we will also, so it says here, with your permission and your child, we will take notes so that we can keep an accurate record of our conversation, and that we would also audio record our conversation, and also that we may recontact them if we have any clarifications or to do a follow-up interview. So we've put in here the expectations from participants as well, that we choose to, that we would like to interview them for about an hour, and that it would be on roughly the themes of their childhood, the family history, and how they were brought up in their families. And now the important thing that we have to share with our participants is our contact details. And this again is something, I mean, gives legitimacy, and also it really stresses accountability, because when we give this piece of paper, they have somebody that they know, okay, this is who the person is, where are they from, and if they need to contact us, they have our phone numbers and our emails. A lot of students ask me whether it's important to give phone numbers because they don't want to be randomly contacted. And my response always is, we are randomly contacting respondents. And if you believe that they should spend their time talking to you because you have a research study to do, then you should be able to answer their phone calls. If there is anything, I mean, it's very, very rare that people call, but you need to be, present yourself as somebody who's approachable, and not give the impression that this is some kind of secret research study that you're doing. And, you know, it's possible that they may forget your name and where you're from in the process of doing the research, but this allows them to have some kind of hold on you if there is anything that happens, and also to give it a certain amount of legitimacy. Okay. So let me get to some questions that I thought would be interesting to think about in this presentation today. And the first is, because of the information sheet and the way in which we are expected to be as open as possible about the research that we are doing. So the question is, should I reveal everything about my research study? Right? So when we define the research really broadly, like, so the example I shared was about sort of saying, okay, we are interested in understanding how children are socialized, but actually the purpose of the research study is to understand how children are socialized in the norm of shame, in Lajjabaya. That's what we are really interested in the study, but we can't exactly say that. We're saying, look, we're interested in how children are socialized. So do you think that by defining the research broadly, are we being deceptive? Now, this is an important question to consider. Now, as a qualitative researcher and ethnographer, and somebody who's very in sort of my research focuses on narratives. So there are certain principles of interviewing when we deal with narratives and discourse. So one is that, as as researchers, we are committed to seeing the world through the eyes of the people being studied. So what this means is that we are not trying to impose our frames of reference onto other people, but we are trying to understand how people make meaning of their experiences, and through that sort of understand their frames of reference. So when we reveal our framework, this can constrain and bias the participants. So if by chance I introduce the research study that Professor Kamila and I are doing, as we are interested in how you how you were socialized in Lajabaya, this can definitely constrain and bias the participants. So one thing that could happen is that people always want to please the person that they're talking to and try to meet their expectations. So they will begin to answer the questions that you ask, remembering that what you're really interested in is this particular topic, and they will sort of try to tailor their answers to that. So that kind of then undermines the whole research process, and also undermines the kind of principles of narrative interviews, which is that we are trying to understand how do people make meaning of their world, not the kind of theories and aims and objectives that we have in doing our research. So in our research proposal, we have perhaps put a theoretical frame into it. We have made certain assumptions about how we want to think about the research and frame it using certain theoretical concepts. But these are not things that we should be sharing with our researchers, because we, as I said before, we will end up biasing them and constraining them in their answers. So there is definitely a certain ethical sort of dilemma that comes in here, because we may also not just bias our respondents, but we also may reproduce dominant discourses, right? Because by saying to them, my assumption is that Lajabaya, of course, is very, very important to the socialization of children in especially in Sinhala Buddhist families, but that may not be the case. There may be other things that are going on through the socialization process that I may not have read up on, or that I may not be aware of, or I hadn't experienced myself growing up in Sri Lanka. And by saying to people that I'm interested in Lajabaya, I'm constraining the breadth of answers and the depth of answers that I can get while talking to people. So it's really important to draw a distinction between research questions, theories, aims, and objectives, and being open to our respondents' ideas, perspectives, and meanings. Of course, there is the other part of this, which is about consent versus public interest, and that a lot of us will be doing research because A, we are interested in contributing to knowledge, but that some of our topics may be important for public interest, and therefore the way in which we obtain consent by defining the research broadly then allows for certain kinds of things to, certain kinds of information to come out. So for example, I'm giving a very simple example. I haven't done this research, but if you think about if you're studying corruption, or the kind of corruption that happens with politicians, and you want to understand how that sort of penetrates into certain communities. Now, if you go and talk about how, to people about, how do you use your politician to get favors or to get in front of lines for certain things, this may completely bias how people talk about it, because as much as we call upon favors and it's part of our culture, we may be quite embarrassed to reveal that we actually do use our privilege to use political power to get to achieve our objectives. So when we reveal, if the researcher reveals that that's the objective of the research, then the whole public interest of kind of, if the researcher's objective is to reveal how political corruption kind of penetrates all the way down, not just at the parliament level, but right down to each of us, then we can understand why it's important to define the research broadly and not reveal everything about the work that we are doing. So my next question is, if my respondent cries, have I caused them harm? Right? A lot of us research sensitive topics. A lot of us research topics in which they may not be sort of overtly sensitive topics, but we ask people to talk about personal experiences. And there are many instances in which we find our respondents upset, or they may even cry. And so when that happens, my question is, are we violating the principle of do no harm? So one of the basic things that we need to, or important things that we need to understand is that do no harm cannot be conflated with discomfort and distress, right? Although we may be discussing sensitive topics, or we may open people up to discussing personal experiences, people will talk about uncomfortable or distress-causing, sad things that have happened to them. And this does not necessarily mean that we are causing them harm. Because one of the ways that we could look at it is, if you think about research as a safe place in which distress can be expressed. So if you take a lot of research that is done in Sri Lanka about disappearances, for example, all of the commissions that took place, time and again over the years, same women came up to the commission and talked about, loved ones that had disappeared. Now, clearly, it causes a lot of distress, and if there's a lot of emotional response, a lot of crying and distress that happens in that kind of research. But nevertheless, clearly that space is also considered a safe place in which distress can be expressed. That is why people are coming and talking about it. And also that there is an expectation that something can be done about it, right? So, of course, if you do psychological research, then there is, of course, an assumption, and I'll talk about this, that talking itself is therapeutic. And you will find that when you do interviews, a lot of people will tell you that they enjoyed the conversation, right? So when I started doing my PhD research into marriage, it was not meant to be any kind of sensitive topic at all. I was interested in mapping out and tracing marriage histories, like how had marriage practices changed, over the course of the 20th century into the first years of the 21st century. But I found myself in certain situations in which people were crying because they had daughters who hadn't got married, who were above 35 and were not married. Or I remember this incident in which this father, when I asked him to talk a little bit about his family, he burst out crying because he had lost a son a few years ago. And he talked about how much he missed him. And clearly it was, in this conversation, they felt comfortable being vulnerable in my presence. My questions didn't necessarily get them to relive these experiences, but they definitely felt that in talking about marriage and family, that it was possible to express their vulnerabilities. And of course, keeping in mind, of course, that you would come across certain situations in which you cannot help people and they are in need of help, not just a sympathetic, empathetic ear. And we tell our students that it's really important, especially if you are researching sensitive topics, that you have certain referrals ready, so that if you find that someone, for example, is experiencing severe domestic abuse, for example, or that there is a child that is in distress, or they're facing severe financial difficulty and they are in need of help, that you have certain people that you can, certain organizations or people that you can refer your respondents to. But a lot of the time, right now, my research is in Avatta, in Colombo too. These are 12 women who are going through a very difficult time due to COVID lockdowns, etc. And there are many times in which they reveal a lot of their difficulties. And right from the beginning, we have made it very clear that the research is not in a position to help them through certain kinds of difficulties, and they are very much aware of it. But time and again, when we have conversations, they talk about how important it is that we comment either on the phone or when it's been possible to visit them, that they find it really reassuring and comforting to talk to us about some of their difficulties, because at least you all are listening. That's what they say. So this is something to keep in mind about research, that it can be a safe place in which distress can be expressed. So the next question I had is, what if I want to research vulnerable populations? So here I want to just introduce you this psychoanalytic theory by Melanie Klein, because my research as an anthropologist also sort of bleeds into psychological anthropology. I'm sort of, I keep those things in mind as well. So Melanie Klein introduces this idea of the defended subject. Now, what that means is that in psychoanalytic theory, you believe that the self is forged out of unconscious defenses against anxiety, right? So as we begin to forge a self from infancy, we begin to categorize the world into good and bad. I'm simplifying this, of course. And then we begin to also categorize people as who can be trusted and who cannot. And we begin to build defenses in how to protect ourselves against the bad or people who cannot be trusted. And we are open to people who can be. So Melanie Klein says that the self is intersubjective, that these defenses are forged in an intersubjective context. Now, how is this relevant to ethics? So what I'm trying to say here is that in psychological research especially, researchers take this stance that trust is a relational process, and people have the necessary defenses with which to protect themselves from unwanted harm. If you ask questions that they feel cross certain boundaries or may cause them distress, and they will choose not to reveal certain things if they feel that it's not important or it's not something that they're comfortable sharing. So you cannot regard people as entirely defenseless. So when we do talk to vulnerable populations, we can't say, oh, here is a set of people that we are responsible for defending, because people have their own defenses as well. So, of course, there is, of course, a question that from psychoanalysis that sort of moves into psychological research, that even if distress is caused, that well-being depends on making known the causes of distress. So what I'm saying here is that there is a school of thought that making people talk about distressing events can be therapeutic, and that it's important for them to talk about it. This is, of course, debatable. Some people would say that some people have defenses and they've shut down and they don't want to remember certain kinds of things. And as researchers, we should not be going into those spaces. If people do not want to open up, we should not be asking those questions, because part of their defense mechanism is to shut down. So that's a debate we can talk about in the question and answer session. There is also, alongside that it's important to get at truth and justice at the expense of distress sometimes. That when we want to reveal certain kinds of things, so early research into what happened during the Holocaust, for example, or things that happened during the Vietnam War, or in Cambodia, I mean, that research is extremely sensitive, and people had to talk to people who had been tortured and many distressing things that happened to them, but they needed people to talk in order to get at the truth of what had happened at that time. So here is, I think, my last question about what if my participants reveal too much. Now, if you are a good researcher and you're a good interviewer, you will find that as people get comfortable with you, that people begin to tell you stories that may not be directly relevant to your research or reveal things that are extremely personal and private. So what happens if people begin to talk too much or in some cases not reveal anything at all, right? So Holloway and Jefferson, who writes this book on doing qualitative research differently, they're two psychologists, say that consent cannot be reduced to a conscious cognitive process, but is a continuing emotional awareness that characterizes every interaction. So here what they're saying is that when we ask for consent and voluntary participation with our information sheet and the consent form that we get them to sign at the beginning, that is only the preliminary process, right? That it is not a once and for all step that we take, because people are not making once and for all rational decisions when they say to us, once we've introduced our research, yes, I'm willing to participate. That consent is something that is an ongoing process. So sometimes people may say yes, but they'll begin to like you and trust you and reveal much more things than they first intended to, because they feel comfortable with you. And so that consent is gained through the process of the interview or through the process of your research. And sometimes you'll find people at the end of an interview saying, and this has happened to me many times, like, I didn't expect to talk so much with you. I didn't expect to tell you that story. So there is then this question about, is the consent that we gain at the beginning from people, is that enough? Should we ask for consent at the end? Now, the British Sociological Association and the British Psychological Association talk about the importance of debriefing participants after the research study is over, keeping in mind that at the beginning, we may not have revealed everything, the aims and objectives of the research, because we didn't want to influence participants' answers. But once the study is over, that it's important to reveal the study's aims and objectives, and to tell participants what is it that we are doing with the findings and how we are framing them and presenting them. And so we have that question as well. That's right at the end, but also about at the end of an interview, when we've discovered that someone who may have been hesitant at the beginning has opened up completely at the end. As researchers, should we be asking for consent at the end? Now, a lot of people, I think, including Dr. Kaushalya, has said that we need to say at the end, because it's the end of the interview, is there anything that you want me to strike out, that you're not comfortable with revealing? There are others who said we've got consent. We should not ask that question and jeopardize the data that we've got, because we've been skillful interviewers and we've gained their trust. So this is then another ethical question that comes up when we do interviews. So I will stop there and hand it over to Dr. Kaushalya.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abeyasekera. Dr. Perera, can I ask you to now make your presentation? And I apologize for not saying this at the beginning. There will be an opportunity for Q&A after the second presentation is over. So please have your questions in hand. And when the time comes to the Q&A, you can put them in the chat box as well, or you can unmute yourself and ask your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mendis, and to actually Dr. Abeyasekera. She's very nicely now brought everyone along to the place where you've prepared, got consent, done the interviews, and what I'm going to talk about is how will we write this up. and how will we, now I'm not going to talk about, one thing I'm not going to talk about is how to analyze qualitative data. That's a different kind of conversation. But I will talk about when you analyze, what are some things to keep in mind in terms of ethics. And when we write, how do we present our participants in a way that then make sure that you haven't divulged their identities, etc. So in analysis, the analytical method and the writing go hand in hand. So for example, if what you're going to do is a very broad-based thematic analysis, then your writing is going to be about the themes. But sometimes, let's imagine you're doing a case study, for example, or a small study of a few people that you're presenting, then you may have to talk about separate individuals. So either way, your writing and how you're presenting your participants and what they said will also then depend on what you want to do with this study. So is it going to be, I mean, these are the things to think about when you're not only at the writing stage, but when you're analyzing your interview transcripts as well. Is it going to be a detailed analysis of one case study? Is the analysis presented narratively? Are you presenting many quotes, or are you going to present a composite? As a novice researcher, I think this was for me the most important thing to learn, that when I'm analyzing, I also have to think about how I'm going to write. The one fundamental thing in terms of ethics when I'm analyzing that I want to share is that we do justice to the data. Now, this doesn't mean that, you know, these people have told you their stories, we have to write about everything they said. That's not what I mean. It doesn't, doing justice to the data doesn't mean that there's a whole pile of data now and that you have to talk about everything, because otherwise you're ignoring what they said. What I mean is that we go out, we interview people because we want to know what they think, what they say about a topic. Once they have said what they have to say about a particular thing, if there will be instances, and I say this with experience, that there will be things that you don't like that they've said. There may be things that you don't agree with. There may be things that upset you. Dr. Abeyasekera spoke about the participants being upset, but there are times when the researcher is also upset about things that were said in the interview. The one thing to keep in mind is that we can't then suddenly ignore certain things that your participants are saying because you don't like it, or you don't agree, or it upsets you, so you don't want to now go and read it. The analysis has to be, you analyze depending on the research question you ask and what they have said, regardless of whether you like it or not. There are ways to deal with it. I know researchers, for example, who were so upset with the interviews and what was said in the interviews, or where the participants were quite anxious and upset, that they waited a few years or didn't use particular interviews because they wanted to give a little time for the participant to think about whether they want to be part of it, or for you to, as the researcher, to be able to deal with it. But generally, don't pick quotes. You will find in methodological literature, you will see the term cherry picking. Don't cherry pick quotes that you like, or don't ignore parts of the story that you don't agree with purely for that sake. Okay, so in the writing of what we have analyzed, I think the biggest debate in writing the analysis of interview data is the tension between context versus confidentiality. And this is something that a lot of the time we talk about with students who use interviews, that because when we use qualitative data, especially interviews, you're using it primarily because you're interested in how people say something, what they say. You want to be able to use quotes. You want to be able to use stories from people. But at the same time, those stories can't just be presented. They need context. They need context so that the reader can understand. Or if you're presenting, the person who's listening can understand what that quote is about, what your analysis says. At the same time, contextual information can also make people and places identifiable. And so this, for me, is a very, it's actually quite a fundamental problem with using view data and doing qualitative research, for example, not just interview data, but in terms of ethnographies, etc., observations, all of it. But it is necessary. The reason we do qualitative research is so that we can understand a particular thing in the richness of that contextual detail, in depth. So how do we balance this out? Anonymizing is necessary. Just to keep in mind, not only for people, but also for places like neighborhoods, if you're researching a neighborhood, an institution, if you're researching a company, for example. So the amount of contextual information, and this is the kind of the criteria I try to keep in mind, is that the amount of contextual information that's necessary when you write or present, it depends on the analysis you're presenting. For the analysis you do, you take everything into context. But when you're presenting it in your writing or your presentations, in a conference presentation, for example, you provide the information about a person or a place or a company or something that aids the analysis. And that's the only thing that's necessary to present. So I usually am guided by Emanuel Shekloff, who is a sociologist, a well-known sociologist, who said it's not enough to say that someone is a woman, because that person may also be other things. We have a tendency generally to rely on demographic or biological categories when we talk about context or contextual background. But how do you know whether what is necessary is whether that person is a woman, or whether that person is a teacher, or whether that person has 3 children, or whether that person has likes pets? How do you know? That depends on what you're trying to present your analysis. So I just want to share with you this little section from Shekloff's article, Whose Text, Whose Context? And he says, for the events of human conduct, we are dealing with sentient beings who themselves orient to their context under some formulation or formulations, who grasp their own conduct and that of others under the jurisdictions of some relevancies and not others, who orient to some of the identities they separately and collectively embody, and at any given moment, not others. And because it is the orientations, meanings, interpretations, and understandings, etc., of the participants in some sociocultural event on which the course of that event is predicated, and especially if it's constructed interactionally over time, which happens in an interview, it's those characterizations which are privileged in the constitution of socio-interactional reality, and therefore have a prima facie claim to being privileged in efforts to understand it. Basically, we are presenting a particular kind of reality through our stories. When we talk to people and we represent or use those, to talk about what we present as our analysis, we are showing the readers or the audience a particular kind of socio-interactive reality. And what we are trying to then present as our context is what has relevance to that particular reality. So I'm going to now share with you a set of examples and a set of strategies on how different people have dealt with interview data in their journal articles. I am focusing purely on journal articles relevant to research in Sri Lanka, but all of this is of course relevant to a dissertation or a thesis or any other kind of research writing that you do as well. So the first thing and the most common thing that we will do, and we do it with the next strategy, masking, that I will talk about, is to leave out information that is not necessary. Remember that Sheglov said, use what is relevant to the socio-interactional event or the thing that you're analyzing. So here's an example. This is the best example I can give you because this is from Louis Morley's study on micropolitics of gender in Commonwealth universities. It includes interviews from Sri Lanka as well. And from in the quotes, all she has actually is little identification categories like one Sri Lankan student said this, a policymaker in Sri Lanka said this, etc. So you can remove a lot of detail and present it. Now that particular study is a broad study and overview of micropolitics. So we are going to assume that the researcher felt that that was all that was necessary to present that. So that's one way to think about what you want to say. You don't have to say everything about the participants, right? No other information is given. And we do it quite a lot. If you think of your own research writing based on interviews, you will see that we do it very often because it's also not possible to say everything about somebody. Here is a study on victimization of sex workers in Sri Lanka. And this is what the researcher says about the participants, right? This research is taken from 24 in-depth interviews and interviews from 3 focus groups with male to female transgender Nachi workers in Colombo, Sri Lanka. There is one street in Colombo in particular that frequent 2 Sri Lankan field researchers did both the contacting and the interviews. Initial contacts were made with individual Nachi sex workers by field researchers while the Nachi were working on the streets. So what is provided is their trans identity. The city where they work has been provided. No other information is given in the article on where they live, what their appearance is, where they may originally have come from, etc. In the analysis section, all you find are quotes accompanied by the pseudonym. That's it. No other contextual information of the participants are given. It's a really interesting study if you want to read it. It's called Dance for Their Dance. And you can see that there's a lot of interviews, but it doesn't mean that you have to then give all the information about every one of these people. The second strategy I want to share with you that people, researchers use is replacing specific information with generic or generalized information. So in the previous study, for example, you would have noticed that the researcher said there is one street in Colombo in particular that they are known to frequent, instead of saying where, etc. So of course, people who are curious may go and try to find out what that street it is. But unless you're like that, generally this particular information has been masked. The researcher also says the participants described, all the participants come from impoverished family backgrounds. There is no research, no other there is no other kind of information on what kind of socioeconomic status or job, etc., that those families have. In Morley's, definitely that's another way of presenting generic or generalized information by saying one Sri Lankan student instead of saying which university, etc. Another strategy that people have shared with me, and I have also sometimes used, is to change the information about a person or place. So for this, I won't share examples from actual articles, but I will share how it's done. You take into consideration what is most necessary for presenting the analysis for the reader to understand the story you present. And then, so for example, if let us say in your analysis, what's important for you is that someone is from the central region. Even if the participant is from Kandy, you can still say the participant is from Mandalay. Sometimes this kind of masking detail is useful if you feel that some of the other information may give away somebody's identity. If what's important is that the participant lives outside Colombo, all you have to say is that the participant is outside Colombo or is from Kurunegala or somewhere. So think about this not as trying to deceive the reader, but as a way of trying to make sure that if some of the other contextual information is necessary and maybe making somebody identifiable, how to make sure that something else doesn't give that away. What can be masked can then be masked. Another thing to do is to summarize the information. This is the third strategy I want to share. Sometimes I see in certain studies a whole table with a lot of information of each participant's various details. This is a hypothetical table. It's not taken from anywhere. But you may say, for example, participant A is female, is 35 years old, is an assistant manager in Varakapitiya, etc. The participant, the second participant is 43 years old, human resources, Yakkala, etc. I'm sure you've seen things like this. One of the problems here is that if the reader is familiar with whatever institution, company, neighborhood, etc., that they're talking, that you're actually writing about, this cluster of informations together can give away somebody's identity. So I would suggest if you're tempted to do this, that you do instead a summary and provide a synthesis. You saw this earlier in Nicole's. She did this particular kind of synthesis, which is the ages of the respondents vary from 18 to 42. Most of them are in their 20s. The average age of entry to the sex industry is 15. So you don't say exactly what age a particular, a specific participant entered the sex work industry. You give an average age. You can say most of the participants are Sinhala, but there are 3 Muslims and a Tamil. So you summarize the information of the whole group so that you don't give away something like, something like this particular table, so that specifics are hidden in a sense. But at the same time, it's not always possible for you to do summaries because your research may be about presenting a fewer number of people, or you want to present case studies, or there is a specific thing about specific people that you want to say. So here, I go back, I want to remind you of what I said at the beginning, that when you analyze, you also think about how you're going to write. So I'm going to give you 2 examples from 2 articles that I've published. One is where I talk about how there were certain power negotiations in the interviews. And for a particular interview, this is all I've said, that Bimal was a senior tenured faculty member in the sciences for about 20 years, that he was an office bearer in the union of his university and well known outside his discipline. So the contextual information is only the information that's necessary to show how this person may be an elite in a sense, or where power is situated. What I've masked are faculty. Keeping in mind that now the sciences is not only in one faculty in the university. I've masked the academic rank, the official role, the discipline, the exact discipline. And I've withheld any description of the university in the article. I've withheld exact subject areas or departments, the age, though you could maybe guess a general age category. I've withheld educational qualifications and the area of residence, etc., etc. So what you see is all that you see about the person in the article. Here's another example from an article that presented how reflexivity changed the participants' understanding of an issue. What the article talks about, the topic under discussion is militarization of universities, and the participant is talking about whether she thinks universities are militarized, but the interviews take place over a period of 3 years. So the information here is chosen to help the reader understand what the participant is saying. So things that may be referred to, and to see how the change in understanding that concept happened over that period of 3 years. So what I won't show you the article because it's fairly long. It's spread, the information is spread over a longer section. But what I've provided is that the academic training is from the West, that the person is fluent in English and Sinhala, that I've met the person through other academics, that she has socialist ideologies, not very uncommon if you're a union member in the university system. But I have not provided or I've taken out the university faculty, discipline, academic position or rank, age, residence, marital status, all of those things. So that's generally some of the main ways that people use when presenting interview data. The last one I want to show you is a useful strategy if you're trying to do, if you're dealing sometimes with sensitive data that you may want to thematically categorize, which is to do composite narratives. It's not often used, but it can be very useful. So it allows for sharing a story or a portrait without providing individual information. I am drawing from Willis's study, or actually she has a really good methodological article on the use of composite narratives, and she takes you through how to do it. And she's using her study on MPs from the British Parliament, the UK Parliament, where she talked to them about how they navigate their political work around environmental issues. Because she uses composite narratives because they are all speaking under the condition of anonymity, but because they're public figures, they can be identified very easily, even if personal details are disguised. So here's what her method summarized in case you want to use it. Basically, she takes a set number of transcripts, and from each she she clusters a number of transcripts or a group of transcripts to make one composite narrative. And so the quotes for that one composite identity is from the different transcripts. Nothing is made up. Some details are taken from one of the interviews. And it does not, she tries not to impose the researcher's judgment on the motives or assess the feelings unless the participant says something. So these composite narratives then are a way of remaining true to the participant stories, but not revealing the individual identity. So let me I'll show you some of the ways in which it describes the composites, but I do want to say also that it may not suit all studies. So here is what Willis says. She says several different groupings were considered, but you can combine them in a number of different ways. But what she does is the composites mix interviewees of both genders, but to tell the story in a readable way, one gender is assigned. So for example, David is formed from a composite of 3 interviewees who are all new to Parliament, and they are all want to speak about climate change or act on climate change. But even though, of course, this means that his colleagues see him as a freak. So here's the reason why these 3 interviewees have been clustered together to form a composite, because of these particular kinds of similarities that Willis has seen in these interviews, these 3 interviews. The same goes for Jonathan. And if you read the article, there is a whole description of how each composite is made. I would really suggest it if you feel that you need to use composite narratives. Now, outside the analysis section, because the analysis section is not the only place where you can give away people's or institutions' identities. Please check acknowledgements. Sometimes I've seen, for example, the analysis section is beautifully anonymized, and in the acknowledgements, suddenly you will see a whole set of thank yous to the managing director or the principal of school, etc., for allowing them, allowing the student permission to come and collect data. So don't do that. Don't include permission letters from the institution as proof. Certainly get permission if you need permission, but keep that letter as proof for yourself. You can write that you have permission or that you did not have permission, but don't add a letterhead, a scanned letterhead into the appendix, for example. Don't add documents with participant institutional personal details like signatures, letterheads in appendices, signed consent letters, handwritten notes to show that they actually did that work. And I'm not exaggerating. I'm taking this all from things that I've experienced with novice researchers. Don't provide photos of the institution or people without careful screening. Sometimes you may want to have photos to show the surroundings, the environment. One thing you could do is, I mean, there are many ways now to disguise visuals. You can use sketches, you can use diagrams, or you can blur the photo, etc. So there are many things you can do. So that's just a few things or a few strategies that I've shared with how to deal with anonymizing identifiable information, while at the same time trying to keep the contextual information you need to analyze or present your analysis in a comprehensible and interesting way. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Perera, for a very comprehensive overview, and also to Dr. Abeyasekera. It's now time for Q&A. We have about, let's see, 15 minutes. Yeah, we can take about 15 minutes for Q&A. So as I said earlier, please feel free to ask your questions either using your audio function, or you can put your questions in the chat as well. I would like you to just identify yourself when you're asking a question, and also identify who your question is directed to, whether you would like Dr. Abeyasekera to answer your question or whether you would like Dr. Perera to answer your question. That will make it easier and quicker, I think. So please go ahead. No questions? We have close to 40 participants. Hamdullah?
No, it's Samudrika. Can I ask a question?
Please go ahead.
I want to ask Dr. Abeyasekera about this. We were looking at that consent form with the information given about the research and like the role of the participant. One of the things I was told is that it's better if we can sort of have a set of statements that people have to sort of initial in front of, so that each thing can be sort of done separate, like they can agree to some things versus, you know, not agree to other things. Is that something is it worth thinking about? I mean, is that better, or the way you showed it better? Is there a difference in the two?
Okay, Samudrika, what I showed you actually was the information sheet, which was giving an overview of the research, but the consent form actually has a series of statements. Which I didn't show, which then says, have you read and understood what it is about? Are you willing to talk about these things? So they tick on each thing, yeah? Or we tick and we ask them the question.
Right. So then, do they get a copy of that, or now this they clearly get the copy? No, do they get a copy of the consent form also?
That's a good question. I think now that you ask it, I was thinking immediately that it would be good to give them a copy of what they signed rather than keeping it to ourselves.
Because when I started doing it, I remember I just kept it to myself. And then students from the university and being undergraduate, they started, Miss Mata copy at the kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then I had to sort of make copies and give it. What I noticed is so when there were 2 pages, that was also a problem. So I had to sort of put the information on one side and the consent form on the other side, and then trying to do it in all 3 languages when space issues came up. But yeah, okay. So we have to negotiate it. Yeah, all right. Okay. So the consent form is separate. I was wondering whether there was no signature there and all that. No, it was just the information sheet you shared with us. Huh?
Yes.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Dr.
So if I can add to that, to Samudrika's question, I actually do give copies of the consent form to my participants. Initially, it used to be a very bothersome thing about photocopying and giving. I have also my own signature, or the person doing the interview.
Yeah.
But now, of course, because of all the social media, it's very easy.
Right.
A lot of the time, the participant and I both sign, and the participant usually takes a photo.
Okay.
So that has helped, because otherwise logistically then you have to go and copy, etc. But that's become much easier now.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Okay. Sorry, Dr. Perera.
Samudrika, I'd like to jump in here and say thank you for that question, because I do think it is important for our participants to have a copy of the consent form, because it is something that has their signature on it. So there's a certain degree of ownership, I think. And it's also good for them to have a record of what exactly they consented to.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Exactly, what they agreed to and what they consented to. In case there is a dispute later on, one would hope, of course, that there would be no such disputes, but it's good to have that. And in the pre-digital era or the pre-COVID era, the way I would do this is that I would have 2 copies anyway when I met a participant, and have them sign both copies. I would keep one and I would give the other one to him or her.
2 originals. Okay.
2 originals. Because it saved you running around for a photocopy machine and the participants after you have interviewed them to give them the copy of the consent form. So
yeah, the first time I did it was like 120, and I'm like, okay. When 2 or 3 people ask, you can't just give the 2 or 3, then you have to make photocopies of all 120 and give it back, So
that is correct. Yeah. All fairness, you should give it to all of them. Yeah. So these are some of the practical things that you need to keep in mind for those of you who are just beginning to start off on your research, or you're halfway through. These are good practical points for you to keep in mind to make sure that your research process goes smoothly, or as smoothly as possible.
Okay. Thank you.
Any
Well,
other questions?
Thank you to both the speakers. It was really interesting and very insightful. Thank you.
Any other questions? You can also write your questions so that I can see it in the chat window. That's fine too.
Professor Mendis, I have a question. And
yes, Mandula, go ahead.
I would like to direct it to Dr. Kaushalya. Actually, this is again something I faced, a practical issue. Now, when you work with students, usually we are advised to get the consent or other permission from the university and higher authorities, etc. But if the let's say the research doesn't really concern let's say the work they do inside the classroom, or you interview them as people, but still they're students, then at what point is the personal consent enough, and you don't have to go beyond and get, like the permission from the, let's say, even the head of that department or anyone else? I was just wondering whether, I mean, just because a student is a part of a department, does it automatically mean that we have to go and before interviewing, go through that permission process?
Thank you, Nandula, for that question. I mean, quite tricky issues, right? I want to say a few things to keep in mind. When I am a lecturer and the person that I'm interviewing is a student, so yes, they, especially in terms of undergraduates or postgraduate students, yes, they are adults. So what you say about when can they consent for themselves is very relevant. But at the same time, we have a particular kind of fiduciary responsibility with regard to our students, right? Even whether they are 90 years old or 20 years old. So I think that is one of the reasons why there is generally requirements that if you're a lecturer, you want to research students, that you get institutional consent. One of the things I would say, therefore, and something that I constantly tell my own students is, don't research your own students. A lot of the time we choose students because, if you're a lecturer or a teacher, because that's the most convenient population. It may actually not be the best population for a study sometimes. If you feel that you don't need to have institutional consent because it's not about institutional things, one thing you could do is make sure that you don't ever interview your own students, but at the same time, you don't need to approach them. You can put out a flyer, or you can put out a call for participants and circulate it. And so that way you could still ask, like you're requesting, you're inviting people to participate, but you are not approaching them. So they have the opportunity to come and talk to you. But it is tricky because of that relationship we have with students, in the same way that, a doctor and a patient would have, or a lawyer and their client would have, etc. That's, I think, the tricky part. It's not the fact that they are part of an institution so much for me personally. And maybe Professor Mendis or Dr. Abeyasekera may have different views, but that other relationship has to be dealt with very carefully. Because when you talk to students, they may feel that they have to consent because you're a lecturer.
I would
Thank you, Dr.
completely
Kaushalya.
agree. sorry, I would completely agree with you, Dr. Perera, because the student lecturer or the student teacher dynamic is very present particularly in our culture, in Sri Lankan culture. So one of the things that you have to be careful about as a researcher is not to ever be accused of coercion, that you in either an overt or covert way got your students to consent to your research when they really didn't want to. And that is why informed consent is extremely important on the one hand, and also having the institution know what you are doing. Because not having the institution know what you're doing could also put you in a somewhat difficult position if an allegation is made against you by a student.
Thank you, Professor Mendis. Yeah, that makes sense. I'm just thinking because you know, practically sometimes I'm at crossroads because I feel that it doesn't really concern the university when it is very you know, when I expect, I mean, when the research doesn't concern anything to do with the university. So then I'm confused whether actually going in for the process just would make it unnecessarily, you know, complicated and time consuming, etc. So I was just at crossroads. I've been at crossroads. So thank you so much.
Well, I would ask a question. Sorry, Kaushalya, you want to go ahead?
No, just to say, ask like, if it is nothing to do with the university, then do you need to do the study with university students themselves? So for example, let's say my study is on reproductive beliefs about reproductive health in young people, right? Then you don't need to have only university students. You could invite various other groups of people, young people, to take part in it. And then you don't have to think about institutional consent anyway, because you're not inviting people who are in your class, in a sense, or in your faculty. So that's my, I mean, obviously, I mean, one of the main reason we would need to have students is if it is relevant in terms of their studenthood, in a sense, no? So that's a question. I mean, I would ask you to consider then, if it is not relevant to the university, whether you need only university students. I think Samudrika also has made a comment.
Yes, let me, before I address, read out Samudrika's comment, I just want to say something in Nandul as well. When you say it is not to do with the university, I would ask a question as to why you are doing the research and in what capacity you are doing the research. Because if you are researching as a university faculty member, then it definitely has to do with the university. Because ultimately, the university's name will go on that research paper or publication, wouldn't it? So you do have an ethical obligation to the university to keep them informed as to what you're doing. So you have to, when you say it's nothing to do with the institution, you have to look not only at your participants but also at yourself. That I think is very important. You're welcome. To go to Samudrika Silva's comment, it's actually more a comment than a question. And she writes, the problem is when institutional heads are also not sure what to do. And she says, I was tossed back and forth between a dean and a head of department when I tried to get permission from them to conduct a study in the faculty. Okay, so for those of you who are in the Faculty of Arts, well, the good news is that there is a faculty research committee, an ethics research committee, and you can go to them and get permission. And through the ethics review committee, you can then speak to the dean or your head of department and say, look, I've already got ethical clearance and this is a research that I'm going to do. But for those of you who are from institutions where you don't have an ethics review committee, then I think the situation might be a little more complicated. So I'm going to toss that question to our two resource persons. What would they do in that situation if they don't have a research ethics committee in place?
Okay, can I answer that?
Yeah.
So you're saying that if there is no ethics approval process that you follow, isn't it?
No, the question, Asha, is what Samudrika was saying was that
yes.
getting permission or getting permission from a head or a dean can be somewhat problematic and challenging, because apparently she was tossed from one person to another.
Okay.
So,
sorry, I misunderstood.
Yeah. In that situation, who do you go to was my question.
Okay. See, okay, I sort of, maybe I'm not the best person to answer this question, but I have to say that it was brought up during the first lockdown when I wanted to do research on how people were coping with lockdown. And I sent out a kind of a wide call asking people if they could circulate my interest in, filling up diary entries. It was not an interview, actually. I wanted people to fill diary entries, and a number of students actually responded. I had sent it to them saying, could you circulate, not asking them to participate. But a few students actually did participate. But I also had a question from 2 colleagues who asked me, did you get permission from the Dean of the Faculty of Graduate Studies to do this study? And I said, no, I didn't. And they said, maybe you shouldn't introduce yourself as being a lecturer from there, because I'm a part-time lecturer. I'm not a full-time employee of the place. So that kept me, it's more a question for me. I refuse to take it out because that is my identity. So, or part of my identity, in terms of what I do. I didn't take it out, but I actually didn't get permission to do that research, even though I was doing it using my title, as it were.
Professor Mendis, can
Go ahead. Please go ahead.
One of the things why this happened to me was, now this was some years ago, right? So the research project had received ethical clearance from another university, right? And the dean's point was that he said, who am I to give you permission? You have received ethical clearance. You are going to approach individuals, give them the information about your study and get their consent. Who am I to give you permission? He asked. That was his question, really. And there I felt he was saying what Nandula just asked. Like, what is it to me, sort of thing. And I felt that then the institution also doesn't have a clear like a picture of what their role, the institutional, sort of the administrative roles didn't have a picture of what they can and should be doing in that situation. And what happened eventually was that I changed the wording in my letter to make it, as you all said, informing the institution type of letter, and got it almost forcefully filed in the department and the dean's office somewhere. I don't know where it got filed in the dean's office. They, in the department, of course, as usual, the correspondence file, they filed my letter that informed the department that I'm doing. These students were not my students. I wasn't teaching any of these students. That is what happened eventually. So that's what I thought. Nandula's question has a point, because I think the institutions also don't know what their role is.
Well, if I may respond to you, Samudrika, you have given us an additional piece of information. You said you already obtained ethical clearance from another institution. So then in that situation, in that scenario, I think when the dean said, why are you asking me for permission? You have already obtained permission, is not really unexpected. So again, I would go to the point, the distinction that you made between permission and informing. So asking for permission is one thing, and that's I think a fairly formal process involving all of the ethical issues that both Dr. Abeyasekera and Dr. Perera spoke to us about today. But informing the head of your department or the dean of your faculty that you are doing this research for which you have already got ethical clearance is a different process. That is merely what you did. You informed them and say, here's my ethical approval. This is what I'm doing. And at that point, if they want to object to what you're doing, that's a different matter. But chances are they will not, as you said, in the case of the dean that you mentioned.
Right. Okay.
So I mean, actually, we should thank Nandula for opening up this can of worms. but I mean, one of the reasons I don't do work like research with students is because it's so fraught. I do research children though, and then that brings in an additional whole round of set of permission.
Another can of worms. No?
Yeah, completely. But I mean, for that, you can't get around all of it. One of the things with institutions, though, I also want to point out from my own experience, when I did my doctoral research on universities and the trade union action and the militarizing issues that were happening at the time, was that so I had ethical clearance from Penn State to do it. And they did not require me to have ethical institutional permission from Sri Lanka. But because I was researching, or my interview participants were academics, right? And I can't tell you the number of times academics have been curious about who else has been interviewed. So heads have wanted to know about people that they know, have you interviewed so and so, etc., etc. So one of the dicey things with institutional permission is also that part, where everyone is then curious about who is being interviewed and then trying to trace who may have been interviewed. I mean, of course, the thing is, I think we are attracted to topics and we are attracted to participants and interviews because also of this really weird social dynamics that happen that you are generally interested in, but that is also another aspect. In some of the institutions that I've been involved in researching outside the university, I've never been able to research, like interview somebody without having that person pointed out to me and being told, okay, you can interview that person. So then confidentiality can be there, but anonymity may not be there. So they are all issues, I guess. I don't know what you mean, Samutrika, about this is true about ELT.
No, what Professor Mendis has mentioned about us having to, you know, like, because sometimes it doesn't have to be action research. It can be any other type of, because we get curious in ELT about the issues we face in our teaching practice. So then when we do research, we want to do it. We want to do it around our students to resolve issues regarding those issues. That then we can't avoid it, kind of thing. There is that reality.
I think I know at least one example where there wasn't a lot of institutional permission, and that was when somebody was researching why students were absent for classes. And the person felt that it was not really the best study to show the institution that they're doing it, so that the participants' identities were then not really divulged.
Right, right.
So Dr. Kaushalya, just one more thing. Now, in that example that you mentioned, so you're thinking in the best interest of the participant and not taking permission. Is that what that researcher decided to do?
The researcher informed that that was what was being done to the place that she was, because the students were from the same faculty that the person was teaching at. But other than the topic, nothing else was divulged. So yes, it was because they felt that then, you know, people, that the faculty may be then worried about or curious about who are the students who are not coming for classes, etc. So some of the information about which student the researcher was interviewing was done through snowballing, etc., and not locating the student through official means.
Right, yeah.
I think, Kaushi, what you mean might be the friend of a friend method of
Yes.
getting your research participants. Yes.
Yeah. So friends, because so then it would be, do you have friends who don't come for classes, and would that person be interested in talking to me? Not, can I know the name of that person?
Exactly.
So that the then the participant can come to you, right?
And that also puts a bit of distance between, I mean, it can preserve anonymity, and it puts distance between yourself and the person who's answering your questions. If it's a friend of a friend, you know, that's a sort of like an added layer of anonymity. And it may make your participant feel more comfortable that there is an added layer of protection or anonymity.
I just have one little question if no one else has any questions. And my question is to Dr. Abeyasekera about friendship and interview participants. And can you talk maybe a little bit? I know we are going a little over time, so I wonder whether you could share a little bit about what it's like when you interview people who are in a close network, for example.
Thank you, Dr. Perera. I mean, that is one of the things that sort of happened during my doctoral research, and then I have been thinking about it, and I was thinking about it when somebody was asking about using their own students. So with my doctoral research into marriage, what happened was that I first chose 2 neighborhoods to research, but I found very quickly that it was very difficult to gain trust when people had not known you from, I mean, they didn't know where to locate you as a person, that I was some random person who was turning up through a gatekeeper, but not known enough to a gatekeeper. So then it just so happened, it was not deliberate on my part at all, that I was very excited about my PhD research. So I kept talking to lots of people about what I was doing. And then many people, colleagues and friends volunteered. They said, look, you have to interview my family because there is so much rich information about various kinds of marriages that had taken place. And you should really talk to my mother, my grandmother, my uncle. So that's how it transpired. It wasn't a deliberate thing. But I have to say that to me, it was because I was studying middle-class marriage practices, and people are very, I mean, marriage is a very personal thing. It worked to my advantage in the end that they were people that I knew because they trusted me and was able to talk about a lot of things that I may not have been able to get out of interviewing complete strangers. And I think the important thing is because of the way in which we connect to people in Sri Lanka, like everyone asked me, who are you? Like, who are you? So when they knew that I was one of their nieces or their granddaughter's friend, immediately they were like, oh, I know who you are. You worked with her or you helped her here. And then it was a lot more easier to gain trust and have people open up to you. It was a much easier. But of course, now that the book is out as well, I have to say that ethics is an ongoing process because not only, I have tried very hard to maintain confidentiality and anonymity because a lot of people are within my networks. But I've had on several occasions, people reveal to others, oh, Asha interviewed me for her study and I'm in the book and or in the thesis. So that has kind of taken me sort of by surprise the first time it happened. And I've thought about the fact that if I were to do this again, I would have to ask them not to talk about the fact that they've been interviewed as just as much as I am saying to them that I won't tell anyone that I have interviewed you, that I'm reassuring them. But I don't know whether I could do that I could sort of say to people, look, I'm interviewing you, but you also have to maintain confidentiality and not reveal to others because you're going to compromise your family or other people that I have promised to confidentiality. When you say that my family got interviewed, you're compromising your mother and your grandmother and aunts and uncles who have given me interviews. So that's definitely a dilemma that I faced. Having said that, though, I have to say that when you do interviews close to the socioeconomic backgrounds that you come from or institutional backgrounds that you come from, that it's hard to move away from those circles. So friend of a friend, yes, that's possibly the distance that you can maintain, because a lot of the time you do reach out to your networks and ask people to participate. And it's based on how much they know you that they trust you enough to participate.
Thank you, Asha.
Okay, so since we have gone quite a bit beyond time, but I think it was a very useful and very rich discussion, question and answer session. Are we ready to wrap up now? Dr. Perera, Dr. Abeyasekera, shall we wrap up?
Yes.
Sure.
With, yeah,
Like
thank
that.
you very much to the two of you. We really appreciate your giving up your Saturday afternoon for this very useful and very meticulously planned out presentation. And thank you to all the participants who were here. We had about over 40, I think, at the beginning, and that's very, very encouraging. Your commitment to research ethics is very laudable. Thank you very much. And may I wish you all a very good evening and stay safe.
And thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.